We've all been curious as to how this two-weapon mechanic works in a practical setting, and after spending some time in a recent beta, I've gathered my thoughts. Some positives, some negatives, and quite a few questions. However, before we dive in, please remember that this beta is just a glimpse of what the final product will offer. Things are still subject to change. With that being said, let's get into my first impressions and a deeper discussion about this exciting new feature. On paper, the ability to equip two different weapons during hunts opens up a world of creative possibilities for players. Depending on your playstyle, you can choose weapons that cover each other's weaknesses. For instance, if you're using a bow and find yourself feeling vulnerable against a particular monster, you can switch to a lance for extra defense. Imagine reaching your last cart and needing a safer option to finish the hunt. Out comes your shield. Alternatively, maybe you want to break a monster's horn, so you might utilise a hammer to do the job before switching back to your longsword for that crucial tail cut. Conceptually, I think it works really well. There was a specific moment during the beta where I truly felt the benefit of the system. I was experimenting with this switch axe against Oshogama. As a casual user of the weapon, I found myself struggling with distancing and getting timings right to dodge after swinging for an attack. So what did I do? I changed my approach during the hunt and swapped over to the hammer where bonking did in fact commence. This flexibility is where the beauty of the two-weapon system shines. We can adapt our game plan on the fly without having to return to camp and hope we have a suitable loadout prepared. Here's another great example of the mechanic in full effect. During a hunt against Ray Dow, I swapped over to my dual blades when he moved over to the sand dunes area. This allowed me to capitalise on the steep landscape and channel my inner Levi Ackerman. I mentioned in a previous video how the environment can play a major factor in your hunts, so switching over to weapons that better capitalises on your surroundings is an absolute game changer. However, with all these positives in mind, I found myself rarely accessing my secondary weapon. As regular players, we've almost been conditioned to feel that the weapon we take into a hunt is the weapon we need to finish it with. Many of us focus on improving our skills with our main weapon, so the idea of putting it away for a secondary feels counterintuitive. Throughout the beta weekend, I was primarily focused on holding my longsword skills against Ray Dow, as well as learning new mechanics for other weapons I'm not too familiar with. Consequently, I didn't feel incentivized as a player to swap weapons. After all, if I'm trying to master the switch axe, why would I pull out a hunting horn? This could be a matter of subjectivity and personal preference, and I understand not everyone may feel that same way, or it could simply be a case of we need to get used to this. It can be hard to escape from the mindset we applied to previous games. If you try to play Wilds in the exact same way you play Worlds, it won't be as fun of an experience when compared to a player that completely leans into the new factors brought in by Wilds. So while presently, yes, I may be conditioned to using one weapon and one weapon only, after a few more hours with the final game or in the demo, I could feel incredibly different. And yes, if you didn't know, you can bring two of the same type of weapon, so two longswords for example. I'll get back to that a bit later. Let's consider new players for a moment. Learning to use one weapon is challenging enough, so is introducing two weapons a bit overwhelming? Here's my take. First off, players don't fundamentally need to engage with a two-weapon system at all. You could easily spend hundreds of hours in a game without even touching your secondary, and it wouldn't necessarily impact your experience. However, I will accept that the game does present players with two weapon slots. Therefore, a new player may feel an implicit expectation to explore both options, and I worry that that may pressure new hunters into using the system when they don't need to. But perhaps could that be a good thing? It may encourage players to experiment with different playstyles and combinations instead of sticking to one weapon and running through the whole game with it. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, while we couldn't experience this in the beta, it's worth noting that in the full game, players will be able to equip the same weapon in both slots. For example, if you favour elemental damage with the dual blades, you could go into a hunt equipped with both a fire element and a water element version of the weapon. This would be incredibly useful, especially considering some monsters have hit zones that change their elemental weakness throughout the hunt. Take Baroth for instance. When he's covered in mud, he's more susceptible to water damage. However, once that mud is gone, fire damage becomes the more effective option. I appreciate that that's quite a min-max and hyper-specific example, but new monsters introduced into Wilds could very well be designed with those factors in mind. Likewise, if you're just running around a locale without a particular target in mind, it will surely benefit you to have quick access to another option depending on what monster shows up. Speaking from experience, I know there's been cases in the Guiding Lance in World where I've had an ice weapon out, and then maybe Velkhana shows up and all of a sudden my loadout's useless. Instead of having to go back to camp and swap out, or instead of having to avoid that monster entirely if I don't have a loadout prepared, I can now instead just get on my secret, pull out my other option. For new players, this means they can continue mastering the same weapon while enjoying a more diverse playstyle option. It could spice things up, allowing you to swap from a raw damage build, for example, to a poison focused build, or maybe as your secondary you run a more fun blast damage setup, just in case you start feeling stagnant. This point is also very important for players who hardcore main one specific weapon. I mentioned earlier how you might not want to change weapon mid-hunt for a variety of reasons. While adapting to the current situation and utilising a more effective tool for the job sounds great, some players do solely want to deal with the current challenge faced by their weapon. And luckily for you, you can continue doing that. At a surface level, the system doesn't punish players who choose to go without it. But I am personally in the camp that the system adds to a player's experience if they do choose to engage with it. What could prove me wrong is monster design philosophy. Could new endgame monsters be added that require you to carry blunt and severing weapons for a mandatory mechanic? I personally highly doubt that Capcom would move to that extreme. In general, the spirit of Monster Hunter is allowing players to make their own choices, and be able to live with them. And while switching to your secondary is a quick process, it's not a completely seamless transition, like how you could swap between red and blue scrolls in Rise in an instant. The Sacred plays a huge part in the mechanic for obvious reasons, and I don't think devs will craft fights based on its usage. That is, unless we get a gimmick fight of some sort. This didn't happen with Palamutes in Rise, so maybe I'm just rambling on, but it's definitely a possibility. Ultimately, another important factor that could make or break the system is of course armor sets and skills. To my knowledge, it still isn't 100% confirmed how this will function. There's been some translated interviews that essentially state that attack-based skills will be attached to the weapons themselves, so even though your armor won't swap out, the key skills you need should always be active to some extent. This, for example, would be things like KO on your hammer or artillery on a bowgun. I suspect we'll get a full breakdown on this in the coming months, but I'm confident in assuming a working solution is in place to ensure swapping weapons maintains viability. If I have missed anything on how armor sets work in this situation, please do let me know in the comments. In general, I believe having the two weapon system seems more fun than not having it. Simply put, it's just another option we can choose to engage with. And if you do want to stick with one weapon, happy days. You can do so without running into any issues. As of right now, I'm heavily leaning into longsword as my primary, with dual blades as my secondary. But I can't lie, greatsword was also a lot of fun and diversified the gameplay's pacing a lot more, rather than swapping to dual blades, which is also another fast weapon. My opinions on all this could very well change depending on the final execution we see next year, and so might yours. So let's bear that in mind when we have conversations down below in the comment section. With that being said, please do let me know your thoughts. What do you like, and do you have any concerns with this feature? Thanks for watching.